This is the first video installment of my Kiwi blog, Communication Across the Ocean. Hi, I'm Jeff Gentry, along with lecturer Zita Joyce here at the University of Canterbury. And Zita Joyce received a PhD from the University of Auckland, and she is a former DJ at RDU Radio here at the University of Canterbury. And as I mentioned, she lectures in media and communication. So, Dr. Joyce, are you a native Cantabrian?
I wasn't born here, but I grew up here. Yeah, grew up here, and I studied at Canterbury until my PhD. And yep, I'm pretty native.
Very good. And so you're an ex-radio DJ. How did you develop an interest in broadcasting?
At that time, I wouldn't say an interest in broadcasting so much as an interest in that particular radio station. So I would have started listening to it when I was at high school, and when I started university, I was such an avid and devoted listener to the radio station that it was. I actually don't know what got me in the door that first day. I think a friend was going in to sort of sign up to be a volunteer, and I just followed along with him. I don't know how I had the confidence to do that. So I started training on my first week on campus, and how many years later? 5-6 years later, I became the program director, and now I'm running internships and doing other kinds of projects through the same station. So I guess that just set in motion a lifelong interest.
Right. And so as program director, was that a paid position at that time?
Yeah.
Very good. And so what has become, I know after the 2011 earthquake, and of course the 2010 earthquake didn't help, but the 2011 earthquake kind of left RDU in tough straits, and you referred me to a really interesting documentary on the radio that I listened to. So what is left, or what is RDU today?
It's quite a different thing than it was before the earthquake. So it's quite different in lots of ways, but it's also, to me, it's the kind of archetypal, inspiring recovery story from the earthquake. So what happened, they, for the 20 years prior to 2011, had been based in a particular studio in the Students' Association building, above the Hang Seng takeaway. It was sort of very rickety stairs above by the extraction fans and things of, classic student radio kind of digs. And it was run. It wasn't, the staff were all paid, but the on-air content was provided by volunteer students. When I was program director, I had 120 volunteers on my list who did the day-to-day shows, that each 10 to 12 kind of slots during the day, and evening specialist shows. So that was how it was still running up until that point. It was owned by then. It was, the license had been sold. The sublease to the license had been sold to a private individual who runs the station on behalf of the UCSA. He was the sales manager. He was from within the culture of the station, so it was very appropriate for him to take it over. And the alternative was having it closed down. So it was private company, but still with a lot of volunteers. So after the earthquake, they were not allowed back in the building. They had one chance to go in and rescue some gear, and then they were off air. So like almost every other, all the independent stations in town. So what they did at first was they plugged a laptop into the transmitter on the top of the hills and ran an iTunes playlist to keep the radio going. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then the production engineer, as production engineers do, set up a production suite in his house, his computer and a microphone, and invited DJs to go and record shows. So the breakfast hosts would go and record a show, stick it on a USB stick, and James, the manager, would drive up the hill and plug the USB stick into the laptop and the transmission, and maintain the transmission, and have a sense of there being some actual radio content. And then in July, I think it was July in the end, 2011, so close to 6 months later, they relaunched the station in a horse truck. So James and Karen, who ran the station, decided that rather than take on a lease, leases on remaining office space were going for such a premium, they didn't want to commit to anything like that. Karen has a great phrase on that documentary where she said she wanted to be able to pick up her skirts and run if anything happened again. So they decided to go mobile and research different kinds of trucks. Realised a horse truck would be a perfect kind of space.
Yeah, with horses painted on the side of it.
Or the Mitsubishi Canter, which is just a perfect name. And a side that you could drop down to let the horses in, which they realised could make a stage. You know, it's the kind of quite visionary ideas that that James can come up with. So anyway, they found one in Auckland, they drove it down, had various misadventures, but by July that year they had renovated it with covered in AstroTurf with a Perspex dome for the taller DJs' heads and office space, a small office space in the front and DJ set up at the back, and so that they could travel around the city, do live to ears, have bands performing on the drop down stage.
So is that their main studio now?
That's their main studio still. And so they had, in order to maintain the broadcast, they have a very complex transmission system involving a mobile phone modem and a few different points, including still a transmitter on the roof of the library tower and the transmitter on the hill. Complicated system, but the base transmission was housed in a room in a building that's a venue and a record shop and an artist studio. And in the summer we moved that base into what was just an editing suite, a sound editing suite on our ground floor that was used by our journalism students. So the main transmission still comes from what they call the RD unit, the horse truck.
Right.
And then it's possible to switch into that broadcast from here.
Very good. So they actually have some walls and a ceiling that helps them in some way.
Yeah, well, we haven't really used it yet. We're training some interns to use it, but the truck does the business.
It does it all.
Yeah,
Very
it's parked in a garden on the other side of town, and
okay. Well, I noticed that RDU's slogan is the only true alternative, and that's kind of neat because my department operates a student radio station 91.3 RSU radio, and the slogan there is your only choice for true alternative music.
Nice.
So it's a nice bond there that even though we don't have to broadcast out of a horse truck, there are those similarities. And so we're running out of time, but if you could tell me a little bit about your research on the radio spectrum. Is there a headline from your research that our students as future broadcasters might want to keep in mind?
I'm not so sure in terms of broadcasting, but my perspective on the spectrum through my thesis was the process by which it's become monetised. So New Zealand was the first country in the world to create property in the radio spectrum and start selling it at auction. From 1989, the Act came in 1989. The first auctions were sort of 1990, 91, and that was on FM radio. So whereas before that, to run an FM radio station, you would apply to the government, and only since 1972 could you apply to the government as a private individual. You had to meet certain public service kinds of requirements and had certain limits on advertising, cross-media ownership, that kind of thing. From 1990 onwards, all you needed was enough money to buy a piece of spectrum at auction. So in terms of broadcasting, what that meant was that at first there was a proliferation of radio stations as lots of people started up different stations, and then there was a long process of consolidation, so into a few companies, so that now, maybe this is the take-home message from New Zealand's experience for broadcasting students, is that now we have an incredibly dense FM band of stations. If you flick through it, you'll find there's something at every
station.
turn.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So we've got an awful lot of stations, and I should be able to tell you the number off my head, but I can't. But there are only two companies who own them.
Two companies, lots of stations, so consolidation then.
Consolidation, and not only that, but there are, so for students in for people in Christchurch, there are very few Christchurch-based DJs. The take-home message for broadcasting students is that there are very few radio DJs left, because all of those stations that you hear on the dial are brands owned by one of the major companies. The two companies have matching brands. They each have a classic hits brand. They each have a top 40 brand.
Right.
They each have this and that. And all of those stations broadcast from Auckland. All the DJs are in Auckland.
Right.
There are very few. There's a breakfast show on, there's a couple of breakfast shows, and there's the odd daytime show that is actually broadcast from Christchurch to a local audience.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's a real difference from the United States, where we have lots of local, not so much local ownership maybe, but at least local
Yeah.
productions in the United States.
Yeah, so Christchurch, I mean, New Zealand has been massively centralised, and it's a small market. It's easier to sell to advertisers.
Right.
The radio networks say that it gives advertisers more certainty over what people are going to hear. That the audiences get better quality radio. If you've got fewer DJs, you can have the best DJs and all that kind of thing. And completely. So the argument is towards that rather than the value of local presence for local people. In Christchurch, the earthquake has. I can't say it's changed it because it hasn't increased local content, but it has at least, I think, from the research I've done, inspired a bit of a pause in that process and an acceptance that actually having DJs on the ground in a major city,
Right.
if something really bad happens, is really valuable.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been Dr. Zita Joyce, who lectures in media and communication here at the University of Canterbury and is a practitioner in her past and a theorist in her present on radio. So hopefully some of our students and faculty in media at RSU can enjoy some of these notes from Dr. Joyce. Thanks so much.
Thank you.